The courthouse corridor buzzed with quiet murmurs as fluorescent lights flickered overhead. The air was thick with tension, the kind that made people hold their breath as they watched something they instinctively knew was wrong. Officer Brian Keller's heavy boots stomped against the marble floor, his grip tight around Marcus Hayes' arm. "Keep walking," Keller barked, his voice sharp and dripping with authority abused. Marcus, a tall black man in his mid-30s, walked with dignity despite the rough treatment. His suit was slightly wrinkled from Keller's earlier manhandling, but his posture remained straight. His chin lifted. His calm demeanor was in sharp contrast to Keller's anger, and it only seemed to enrage the officer more. "You think you're untouchable, huh? Think you can just walk around, sticking your nose where it doesn't belong?" Keller's voice rose, echoing through the corridor. The crowd that had gathered, court staff, visitors, even a few jurors, stood frozen. Their expressions ranged from confusion to disbelief. Whispers rippled through the hallway. "What did he even do?" one woman muttered. "He looks calm, too calm for someone guilty," another said. Marcus glanced at Keller, his deep brown eyes steady. "Officer, I've complied with your every demand. There's no need for this." Keller smirked, his grip tightening as he shoved Marcus forward. "Don't talk unless I ask you to. You're already in enough trouble." The murmurs grew louder. Even those who didn't know Marcus could sense the imbalance here, the way Keller's anger overshadowed the supposed justice he claimed to enforce. As they rounded a corner, Marcus caught sight of a young girl clutching her mother's hand, her wide eyes brimming with fear as she watched the scene unfold. He offered her a small, reassuring smile. It was a brief moment, but it spoke volumes. In that smile was resilience. In his posture was grace, but Keller was relentless. His accusations spilled into the open air, harsh and unfounded. Interfering with an officer, obstruction of justice, resisting arrest, none of it was true. But the crowd didn't know that. Not yet. Marcus didn't fight back. He didn't shout or defend himself. His silence wasn't weakness, it was control. As they neared the courtroom doors, Keller's voice dropped to a low growl. "People like you always think you can talk your way out of things. Not today." Marcus exhaled slowly, his shoulders rising and falling in measured patience. He wasn't afraid. Not of Keller, not of this courtroom, not of the twisted narrative being built around him. But he was weary of these encounters, weary of the cycle. The wooden double doors loomed ahead. Beyond them lay the sterile formality of the justice system, a place where truth was supposed to prevail, but often people like Keller found ways to manipulate it. The crowd's murmurs faded as Keller shoved the doors open, pulling Marcus inside. For a brief moment, Marcus turned his head and met the gaze of a man standing near the entrance. An older gentleman with spectacles perched on the end of his nose, his face etched with lines of wisdom and worry. The man nodded slightly, a silent acknowledgement, an unspoken promise. As the doors closed behind them, sealing Marcus and Keller inside, the air in the corridor felt heavier. The spectators stood in silence, the weight of injustice pressing down on their shoulders. And somewhere deep inside that courtroom, the battle for truth was about to begin. The morning sun bathed the city in a soft golden light, reflecting off glass skyscrapers and warming the faces of early commuters. Marcus Hayes walked briskly down the sidewalk, a leather briefcase in hand and purpose etched into every step. Today was an important day. A case awaited him at the courthouse, one that could shape lives far beyond his own. But despite his focus, Marcus remained aware of the world around him. At the corner of 5th and Main, he noticed an elderly woman standing near a bus stop, her frail hands patting down her coat pockets, and her brow furrowed in distress. Her shopping bag rested by her feet, half open, revealing a few modest groceries. "Excuse me, ma'am," Marcus said gently as he approached. "Are you all right?" The woman looked up, her pale blue eyes filled with worry. I can't find my wallet. I must have dropped it somewhere." Her voice trembled, each word carrying the weight of her fear. "It had my ID, my bus pass, everything." Marcus knelt slightly, bringing himself to her eye level. "Don't worry, we'll find it. Did you check your bag?" "Yes, twice." Her voice cracked. "All right, let's retrace your steps," Marcus said with calm assurance. He scanned the area quickly, noting the nearby sidewalk cracks and the bench she had been sitting on. After a brief moment, something caught his eye. A small brown leather wallet, partially hidden under the bench. "Is this it?" Marcus held it up, and relief flooded the woman's face. "Oh, bless you," she exclaimed, clutching the wallet tightly against her chest. "You have no idea. I can't thank you enough." Marcus smiled, his warm presence diffusing the tension in the air. "I'm just glad we found it, ma'am. Are you all right to get where you're going?" Yes, thank you, young man." Her gratitude was raw, heartfelt, and Marcus felt its weight settle deep in his chest. As he stood up to leave, a passerby who had been watching the exchange approached him. A middle-aged man with a coffee cup in hand and a tired expression on his face nodded toward Marcus. "That was kind of you. Not many people would have stopped." Marcus gave a small shrug. "It doesn't cost much to care." The man smiled faintly, as if those words had sparked something within him. "We need more people like you." Marcus offered a small nod and continued on his way, his briefcase swinging lightly at his side. The courthouse stood just a few blocks away now, its cold stone facade stark against the morning sky. But Marcus didn't feel the chill of its imposing shadow. The warmth of doing something good carried him forward. The courthouse stood ahead, its stone facade towering and unyielding against the pale morning sky. Marcus Hayes adjusted the strap of his leather briefcase as he approached the wide marble steps. The encounter with the elderly woman lingered in his mind, a reminder of how small actions could ripple outward. But as his polished shoes touched the first step, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Hey, you can't stand there. Move along." Marcus's eyes followed the voice to a scene unfolding near the entrance. A young black teenager, no older than 16, stood frozen on the steps, his hoodie pulled up over his head and his hands shoved into his pockets. Officer Brian Keller loomed over him, one hand resting menacingly on his belt. I'm not doing anything wrong," the boy stammered, his voice trembling. Keller took a step closer, his shadow swallowing the boy whole. "Don't talk back to me, kid. You've been standing here too long and I don't like the look of you. Are you waiting for someone? Got business here?" The teenager hesitated, his sneakers scraping against the stone steps as he tried to step back without drawing more attention. His face was pale with fear. Marcus's chest tightened. He'd seen this before, the imbalance of power, the way authority could turn into a weapon in the wrong hands. He took a steadying breath and stepped forward. "Good morning, Officer Keller," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. Keller turned, his hand still hovering near his belt. His sharp blue eyes scanned Marcus, recognition flickering across his face. "And you are?" "Someone who doesn't believe this young man has done anything wrong." Marcus looked directly at the boy. "Are you okay, son?" The teenager nodded weakly but said nothing. Keller's jaw tightened. "This isn't your business, sir. Step back and let me do my job." Marcus didn't move. His tone remained even, but there was steel beneath his words. "And what exactly is your job right now, officer? Because from where I'm standing, it looks a lot like harassment." A murmur began among passers-by who had started to slow down, their attention drawn to the scene. Keller noticed the growing audience and straightened his shoulders. "This kid was loitering. I'm asking him a few questions and he's not cooperating." "Loitering," Marcus repeated, tilting his head slightly. "On the steps of a public courthouse? Is that a crime now?" The teenager's eyes darted between Marcus and Keller, fear giving way to a flicker of hope. Someone was standing up for him. Keller's face flushed red. "You're obstructing my investigation." Marcus's voice grew sharper, his words measured but unmistakably authoritative. "There's no investigation here, officer, just intimidation." For a brief moment, the air stood still. Keller's nostrils flared, and his hand finally moved toward Marcus's arm. "That's enough," Keller barked, grabbing Marcus by the sleeve. The movement was sudden, aggressive, and it drew audible gasps from the onlookers. "Officer," Marcus said sharply, pulling his arm free, "think very carefully about your next move." But Keller was already too far gone. He reached for his handcuffs, his face twisted with anger. "You're coming with me. You're under arrest for obstruction and interfering with police work." The teenager stepped back quickly, his sneakers squeaking against the stone steps. Marcus stayed calm, his head held high even as Keller's iron grip closed around his wrist. "Is this really how you want this to go, Officer Keller?" Marcus asked, his voice low enough that only Keller could hear. But Keller said nothing. He was too caught up in the authority he believed he wielded. The crowd was silent now, watching as Keller forcefully turned Marcus around and pulled him toward the courthouse doors. The teenager watched, wide-eyed, as Marcus was led away. Their eyes met briefly. One glance, heavy with unspoken words. "It's okay," Marcus mouthed silently to him. The boy stood frozen as Marcus disappeared through the courthouse doors, Officer Keller's angry voice echoing through the marble corridors. The echo of Officer Keller's boots reverberated down the marble corridor as he dragged Marcus Hayes into the courthouse. The ornate walls, meant to symbolize justice and integrity, felt cold and unfeeling under the weight of what was happening. Marcus walked with dignity, despite Keller's tight grip on his arm, his composed demeanor a sharp contrast to the officer's barely contained fury. Spectators in the hallway froze, their gazes flicking between Keller's aggressive posture and Marcus's unyielding calm. A few whispered under their breath, their unease spreading like ripples on water. As they entered an empty courtroom, Keller shoved Marcus into a wooden chair near the clerk's desk. The large room, with its grand judge's bench and rows of empty pews, seemed cavernous and indifferent. "Sit there, and don't move," Keller growled, his voice low but venomous. Marcus adjusted his cuffs and sat upright, his gaze steady on Keller. "Officer, do you realize the gravity of what you're doing?" Keller ignored him, instead striding toward the bailiff nearby. "Obstruction of justice, assaulting an officer. He resisted arrest. Write it all down," Keller barked. The bailiff hesitated, his pen hovering over a clipboard. "Assault? I didn't see him." "You weren't there, were you?" Keller snapped, his eyes sharp and daring anyone to contradict him. The bailiff nodded stiffly and began scribbling notes. Marcus watched the exchange, his jaw tight but his expression neutral. "You're painting quite a picture, Officer Keller," Marcus said evenly. His voice was soft, but it carried across the empty courtroom with clarity. "But it's missing something important, the truth." Keller's lip curled upward in a sneer. "Truth? You think anyone's going to believe you over me? A decorated officer of the law?" At that moment, the door creaked open, and the court clerk, a sharp-eyed woman named Emily Grant, stepped in. Her graying hair was pinned tightly back, and her no-nonsense demeanor carried with it years of navigating courthouse chaos. "What's going on here?" Emily asked, her voice crisp. "Obstruction, ma'am," Keller said without missing a beat. "Mr. Hayes here decided to interfere with an active investigation. I'm processing the paperwork now." Emily's sharp gaze flicked to Marcus. "Is that true, sir?" Marcus exhaled slowly before responding, his words carefully measured. "No, ma'am. I witnessed Officer Keller harassing a young man on the courthouse steps. I intervened verbally. There was no obstruction, no resistance, and certainly no assault." Emily's eyes lingered on Marcus for a moment. There was something about him, his calm, his clarity, the way he held himself, that made her pause. "Officer Keller," she said carefully, "why don't you step outside for a moment and let me speak with Mr. Hayes?" Keller's face turned crimson. "Ma'am, with all due respect." "That wasn't a request," Emily said firmly. Keller hesitated, his jaw working as if chewing on his pride before he finally turned and stormed out of the room, the door slamming behind him. Emily turned back to Marcus, her expression softer now, but still guarded. "Mr. Hayes, I need to ask, are you a lawyer?" Marcus hesitated, his fingers tracing the edge of his briefcase. He gave her a small, knowing smile. "Something like that." The clerk's brows furrowed, but she said nothing more. She could feel that Marcus wasn't an ordinary man, and yet he wasn't ready to reveal everything just yet. "I'm going to make sure this doesn't escalate further," Emily said quietly, "but you need to remain here for now. I'll be back shortly." As Emily exited the courtroom, Marcus leaned back slightly in his chair, his head tilted upward toward the large courthouse emblem carved into the wall above the judge's bench. It was meant to represent fairness, equality, and justice. But in that moment, it felt hollow. The weight of false accusations settled heavily on Marcus's shoulders, not because he doubted himself, but because he had seen this story play out too many times before. Lives derailed, reputations destroyed, all because someone in power decided to twist the truth. His fingers tightened slightly around the handle of his briefcase as he closed his eyes briefly. But there, in the stillness of the empty courtroom, Marcus made a silent promise to himself. This time, the truth would not be silenced. The faint murmur of voices filled the courtroom as people began to trickle in, their footsteps echoing softly against the polished wooden floor. Sunlight streamed through tall, arched windows, illuminating dust particles suspended in the still air. The weight of expectation hung heavy, like a storm cloud waiting to break. Marcus Hayes sat at the defendant's table, his posture poised and composed. His dark suit, though slightly creased from Officer Keller's rough handling, still carried an air of quiet authority. His eyes scanned the room, noting every detail, the weary expressions of court staff, the side glances exchanged by strangers, and the tight-lipped impatience etched into Keller's face as he lingered by the doorway. Emily Grant, the court clerk, re-entered the room and approached Marcus with measured steps. Her presence brought a fleeting sense of order amidst the chaos. "Mr. Hayes," she said quietly, leaning slightly toward him. "The judge will be arriving shortly. I've reviewed Officer Keller's report, and let's just say there are inconsistencies." Marcus nodded, his lips forming a faint smile. "Thank you, Miss Grant. I appreciate your diligence." Before Emily could respond, the courtroom doors swung open with authority, and Judge Alexander Price entered. He was a towering figure in his black robes, his stern face carved with years of hard decisions and sleepless nights. His gavel struck the wooden block with a sharp crack, silencing the murmurs instantly. "Court is now in session," Judge Price announced, his gravelly voice filling every corner of the room. "Officer Keller, please approach." Keller strutted to the witness stand, his chest puffed out and his hands gripping the edge of the podium like a lifeline. His voice was steady, but there was a nervous edge to it. "Your Honor, the defendant, Marcus Hayes, obstructed an ongoing investigation, resisted arrest, and displayed behavior consistent with hostility toward law enforcement." Judge Price's sharp gaze shifted to Marcus. "Mr. Hayes, do you wish to respond to these accusations?" Marcus rose from his seat. The room fell silent as every eye turned toward him. His voice, though calm, carried a weight that seemed to press against the walls. "Your Honor, with all due respect, Officer Keller's accusations are not only baseless but also demonstrably false. I did not obstruct an investigation because there was no investigation taking place. I did not resist arrest. I merely questioned the officer's conduct as he harassed an innocent teenager on public courthouse steps." Judge Price raised an eyebrow and glanced at Keller. "Officer, is there any evidence of Mr. Hayes behaving aggressively or obstructively?" Keller shifted uncomfortably, his fingers drumming against the podium. "It's my word against his, Your Honor." "And yet," Marcus continued, his voice steady and unyielding, "we're in a courthouse, a place where words must be weighed against evidence. So where is yours, Officer Keller?" A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Keller's face turned crimson as he fumbled for a response. Emily Grant, seated nearby, exchanged a glance with the bailiff, a look that spoke volumes. Before Keller could stammer out an answer, the courtroom door creaked open, and a young clerk rushed in, clutching a folder to her chest. "Your Honor," she said breathlessly, "I apologize for the interruption, but there's been an urgent development regarding this case." Judge Price's expression darkened. "Approach." The clerk handed the folder to the judge, who flipped it open, his eyes scanning the pages with growing intensity. The courtroom felt suspended in time, every breath held, every eye locked on the judge's face. After a long pause, Judge Price closed the folder and set it down with deliberate care. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low but firm. "We will recess for 15 minutes while I review this information further. Court is adjourned." The gavel struck once, and the room buzzed to life with whispered conversations and shifting bodies. Keller shot Marcus a venomous glare before storming out of the courtroom. Marcus remained still, his hands resting lightly on the table in front of him, his expression unreadable. Emily Grant approached again, her voice soft. "Whatever was in that folder, it seemed important." Marcus nodded, his gaze focused on the door where Keller had disappeared. "The truth has a way of surfacing, Miss Grant, even in the darkest corners." The courtroom buzzed with uneasy energy as people shuffled back to their seats. The recess had been brief, but it carried the weight of expectation. Whatever had been in that folder had shifted something fundamental. Judge Price sat once again behind his imposing bench, his sharp eyes scanning the room like a hawk assessing its prey. Officer Keller stood near the witness podium, his shoulders squared, but his face betraying a faint crack in his confidence. Marcus Hayes remained seated, his hands calmly folded on the table in front of him. His expression was serene, but his eyes, those steady, unflinching eyes, held a fire that couldn't be extinguished. The judge cleared his throat. "We are reconvened. Mr. Hayes, please rise." Marcus stood, his tall frame commanding quiet respect. The room stilled. "Before we proceed," Judge Price said carefully, "I'd like to address something brought to my attention during the recess." He lifted the folder and tapped it lightly against his desk. "It seems there is some significant context missing from today's proceedings. Mr. Hayes, would you care to clarify your professional role for the court?" The room seemed to shrink, every ear straining to catch Marcus's next words. Keller's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. Marcus exhaled slowly, then spoke with a clarity that sliced through the air like glass. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of this courtroom, my name is Marcus Hayes, and I am the Chief Federal Prosecutor for civil rights violations under the Department of Justice." The silence that followed was almost deafening. Somewhere in the gallery, someone gasped. Keller's face drained of color, his mouth slightly open, as if the ground had disappeared beneath him. Marcus continued, his voice steady but charged with undeniable authority. "I oversee cases exactly like the one Officer Keller seems to have fabricated today. My role is to ensure that abuses of power and miscarriages of justice are brought to light and held accountable, regardless of rank, badge, or uniform." The crowd erupted into murmurs, a mixture of astonishment, shame, and disbelief. Emily Grant, the court clerk, looked down briefly, her lips pressed into a thin line as if to suppress her reaction. Keller stammered, his voice breaking through the noise. "Your Honor, this isn't." "Enough, Officer Keller," Judge Price interrupted, his gavel striking once. The sternness in his voice left no room for argument. "Sit down." Keller slumped into a nearby chair, his hands shaking slightly as they rested on his knees. Marcus turned slightly, addressing the courtroom, his voice warmer now, but still firm. "What happened today isn't just about me, or Officer Keller, or even the young man on those courthouse steps. It's about the kind of world we allow ourselves to live in. A world where power can either protect the vulnerable or be wielded against them like a weapon." The weight of his words settled over the room like a heavy blanket. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some looking down at their hands, others meeting Marcus's gaze with admiration and shame intertwined. "Your Honor," Marcus continued, turning back to Judge Price, "I would request that this matter be formally reviewed and that Officer Keller be temporarily suspended pending investigation." Judge Price nodded gravely. "Consider it done, Mr. Hayes. Officer Keller, you are hereby suspended from duty until this matter is fully investigated. Bailiff, please escort Officer Keller out of the courtroom." The bailiff approached Keller, whose shoulders slumped as he rose to his feet. He avoided eye contact with everyone as he was led out of the room. The heavy wooden doors closed behind him with a muted thud. Marcus let out a slow breath, his shoulders relaxing slightly for the first time all day. Emily Grant approached him, her voice quiet but steady. "You knew this would happen, didn't you?" Marcus offered her a faint smile. "I hoped it wouldn't, but I was prepared if it did." She nodded, her respect for him now unmistakable. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes, for standing your ground." As the courtroom began to empty, people walked past Marcus with looks of quiet gratitude and admiration. Some whispered thank yous, others offered small nods of respect. A mother, holding her daughter's hand, stopped briefly to say, "You gave us hope today." Marcus smiled warmly, his voice soft. "That's all I could ever hope for." As the crowd thinned, Marcus stood alone for a moment in the vast courtroom. The emblem of justice loomed above him, carved into marble, its scales perfectly balanced. But Marcus knew justice wasn't always balanced. Sometimes, someone had to step into the storm and hold the line. Today, that someone had been him. The courthouse doors swung open, and Marcus Hayes stepped outside into the afternoon sun. The light hit his face, warm and unfiltered, as if the universe itself had exhaled a breath it had been holding. The air felt different out here, lighter, freer after the stifling tension of the courtroom. The wide steps of the courthouse were crowded now. Spectators, courthouse staff, and curious onlookers had gathered, their conversations hushed but urgent. For a brief moment, Marcus paused at the top of the steps, his tall figure silhouetted against the imposing stone pillars behind him. A voice broke the silence. "Mr. Hayes." A woman stepped forward from the crowd. She looked to be in her early 40s, with tired eyes and a voice trembling with emotion. I wanted to thank you. What you did in there, it wasn't just brave, it was necessary." Marcus offered her a small smile, his warm eyes meeting hers. "No thanks are needed, ma'am. Justice shouldn't be an act of bravery, it should be standard practice." From somewhere in the crowd, the teenager Marcus had defended earlier emerged, his hoodie now pushed back, revealing a youthful face etched with quiet awe. His steps were hesitant, almost unsure, but his eyes locked onto Marcus with gratitude that words couldn't quite capture. "Hey," Marcus said softly as the boy approached. "You all right?" The boy nodded, stuffing his hands into his pockets. "Yeah, I wanted to say thank you. Nobody's ever stood up for me like that before." Marcus placed a steady hand on the boy's shoulder. "You deserve to be treated with respect. Don't let anyone make you believe otherwise." The boy swallowed hard, nodded, and then turned back toward the crowd, disappearing into the sea of faces. It was a fleeting interaction, but it carried the weight of unspoken promises. Reporters had begun to gather at the base of the steps, microphones raised, cameras rolling. Their voices overlapped as they shouted questions. "Mr. Hayes, do you believe Officer Keller will face consequences for his actions? Do you think systemic changes are needed in law enforcement? What message do you hope today sends to the community?" Marcus raised a hand and the crowd quieted. His voice was calm, steady, but carried a resonance that commanded attention. "Today wasn't about me. It wasn't about Officer Keller. It was about accountability. It was about drawing a line in the sand and saying, no more. Every one of us has a role to play in ensuring justice isn't just an ideal carved into stone above courtroom doors. It's a living, breathing reality." The crowd absorbed his words, their faces reflecting a spectrum of emotions: hope, sadness, determination. Marcus continued, his voice growing softer but no less powerful. "Change doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen without effort. But every small act of courage, every moment where someone chooses to do what's right instead of what's easy, that's where it starts." The murmurs of agreement rose from the crowd. A woman dabbed her eyes with a tissue. A young father, holding his toddler daughter in his arms, gave a small nod of respect. Emily Grant, the court clerk, appeared at the top of the steps, her arms crossed and a knowing smile on her face. She caught Marcus' eye and nodded once, a silent acknowledgement of shared understanding. Behind her, courthouse staff peered out from the doorway, their faces reflecting a mix of admiration and relief. Marcus descended the steps slowly, his polished shoes clicking softly against the stone. Each step felt heavier than the last, not with exhaustion, but with the weight of responsibility. Justice wasn't a finish line, it was an ongoing journey. At the bottom of the steps, a little girl with curly hair and bright eyes stood clutching a bouquet of slightly wilted flowers. Her mother knelt beside her, whispering something in her ear before the girl shyly stepped forward. "These are for you," she said softly, her tiny hands outstretched. Marcus knelt down, accepting the flowers as if they were the most precious gift he'd ever received. "Thank you, sweetheart. These mean more to me than you know." The girl smiled, her dimples deepening, before retreating back into her mother's embrace. Marcus stood up, flowers in hand, and walked toward the street. The crowd began to disperse, but the feeling lingered, a shared moment of clarity, of hope, of purpose. As Marcus walked away, the courthouse stood tall behind him, bathed in golden light. Its towering presence had always symbolized justice. But today, for the people who had witnessed the events unfold, it felt like something more. It felt like hope. The soft hum of jazz piano filled the corner of the cafe, blending seamlessly with the faint clink of mugs and the murmur of quiet conversations. Marcus Hayes sat at a small table near the window, his coat draped over the chair beside him. A warm cup of coffee sat in front of him, steam curling into the air, carrying with it a fleeting sense of comfort. Outside, the city moved at its relentless pace. Cars honked, pedestrians crossed streets with hurried steps, and life went on, as it always did. But inside this little cafe, there was stillness, a fragile pocket of peace carved out in a world that never seemed to pause. Marcus wrapped his hands around the ceramic mug, letting its warmth seep into his palms. His reflection stared back at him from the window. A man who had spent the day walking a tightrope between courage and restraint, dignity and defiance. The weight of what had transpired in the courthouse still hung heavy on his shoulders. "Rough day, huh?" The voice came from across the table. An older man with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes had taken the seat opposite Marcus. He wore a worn leather jacket and a scarf that had seen better days. His face was lined with years of experience and quiet resilience. Marcus offered a faint smile. "You could say that." The man nodded knowingly. "I saw you on the courthouse steps. You spoke well. You stood tall." For a moment, Marcus didn't respond. He simply stared into his coffee, watching the faint ripples dance across its surface. "Sometimes," Marcus said finally, his voice low, "standing tall feels like standing alone." The older man tilted his head slightly, his eyes soft with understanding. "But you weren't alone, son? Did you see their faces? That boy on the steps? That little girl with the flowers? You weren't standing alone. You were standing for them." The words settled heavily in the space between them, their weight undeniable. Marcus nodded slowly, his lips pressed into a thin line as he absorbed the truth of it. "You know," the man continued, leaning back in his chair, "I've seen a lot of fights in my time. Some worth it, some not. But the ones that matter most, the ones that stick with you, are the ones where you stood up for someone who couldn't stand up for themselves." Marcus let out a slow breath, the corner of his mouth lifting in a half-smile. "That's the hope, isn't it? That every small fight builds towards something bigger." The man smiled in return. "It does, even if you can't see it right away." The two men sat in silence for a moment, the jazz piano swelling gently in the background. Outside, the streetlights flickered to life, casting a warm golden glow over the sidewalk. Marcus reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the slightly wilted bouquet of flowers the little girl had given him. He set them on the table between them, their fragile petals illuminated by the soft light overhead. "She didn't have to do that," Marcus said softly, his voice catching slightly in his throat. "But she did." The older man nodded, "Because she saw you. Not just what you did, but who you are, and that's something people don't forget." Marcus looked back at the man, his eyes glassy with emotion. "Thank you for reminding me." The man gave him a firm nod before rising from the table, his scarf trailing slightly as he turned toward the door. As he walked away, Marcus realized he didn't even know the man's name, but somehow it didn't matter. Alone again at the table, Marcus let out a deep breath and picked up one of the flowers from the bouquet. Its petals were soft against his fingertips, fragile yet resilient, much like hope itself. Outside the window, the city stretched out before him, a mosaic of light and shadow, triumph and tragedy, injustice and fleeting moments of victory. But despite it all, Marcus felt something stir deep in his chest. A quiet determination, a resolve that couldn't be shaken. He finished his coffee, set the bouquet carefully back into his coat pocket, and stood to leave. The bell above the cafe door jingled softly as he stepped out into the cool evening air. The world hadn't changed overnight. The system wasn't fixed. The problems weren't gone. But Marcus Hayes walked into the night with purpose in his step and hope in his heart. Because sometimes, the fight isn't about winning every battle. It's about refusing to stop fighting at all. The sterile hum of fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above as Marcus Hayes walked through the wide halls of his office building. The Department of Justice seal gleamed proudly on the glass door as he passed through, his polished shoes clicking softly against the tile floor. Behind these walls, justice wasn't an abstract ideal. It was a living, breathing responsibility. And tonight, that weight sat heavy on Marcus's shoulders. His assistant, Tasha Bennett, a sharp-witted woman in her late 20s with a knack for organization and an unyielding sense of loyalty, stood waiting by his office door. Her curly hair was tied back into a loose bun, and her tablet was clutched tightly to her chest. "Long day, sir?" she asked softly, her voice carrying a blend of concern and respect. Marcus gave her a tired smile. "You could say that." She stepped aside to let him into his office, a large but minimalist space with dark wooden shelves lined with legal volumes and framed photographs of Marcus with his family, mentors, and colleagues. The city lights twinkled faintly through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the desk. Tasha hesitated at the doorway. "You should know, there's been a lot of chatter today about the courthouse incident. Some good, some less so." Marcus set down the slightly wilted bouquet of flowers on his desk, the small gift from the little girl earlier that day. He looked at them for a moment before turning back to Tasha. "Let them talk, Tasha. Truth has a way of outlasting noise." She nodded, her lips pressing into a faint smile. "There are emails waiting for you, a lot of them, and there's someone in the conference room waiting to speak with you." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Who?" She hesitated. "Deputy Director Stephen Caldwell. He flew in from D.C. an hour ago." Marcus exhaled slowly, the weight of the day pressing down again. "All right, let me handle it." Tasha nodded and left, her heels clicking softly as she disappeared down the hall. The conference room was dimly lit, with only the glow of the city lights spilling across the long mahogany table. At the far end sat Deputy Director Stephen Caldwell, a tall man with graying hair and sharp hawk-like eyes. His presence carried authority, and the lines etched into his face spoke of decades spent navigating political minefields. "Marcus," Caldwell said evenly, rising from his chair as Marcus entered. "Take a seat." Marcus sat across from him, his back straight, his hands folded neatly in front of him. "I've been briefed on today's events," Caldwell began, his voice cool and measured. "The courthouse, Officer Keller, your revelation in court." Marcus met his gaze head-on. And while I respect the outcome, Marcus, I need to remind you that optics matter. You're not just any attorney, you're the chief federal prosecutor for civil rights violations. Every move you make carries weight. Marcus's voice remained calm, but there was an edge to it. "Are you suggesting I should have stayed silent while a young man was being harassed, while lies were being woven into official reports?" Caldwell sighed, leaning back in his chair. "No, Marcus. I'm saying that every action has consequences. There are people, powerful people, who aren't pleased with what happened today." Marcus shook his head slowly. "With all due respect, Stephen, if those people are upset because justice was served, then perhaps they're part of the problem." The two men sat in silence for a moment, the tension thick in the air. Caldwell rubbed his temples, exhaustion flickering briefly across his face. "Marcus, you're one of the finest prosecutors I've ever known. But you're walking a tightrope here. Be careful, because if you fall, it won't just be you. It'll be the people who believe in you, the people who need you." Marcus nodded slowly, his expression softening. "I hear you, Stephen, but I can't, not for 1 second, allow fear of fallout to stop me from doing what's right. If we let fear guide us, we've already lost." Caldwell studied him for a long moment before nodding faintly. "I suppose that's why you're sitting on this side of the table, and I'm not." He stood, extending a hand across the table. Marcus shook it firmly. "Watch your back, Marcus. The world doesn't always reward integrity." "Then it's up to us to make sure it does," Marcus replied. Caldwell offered a faint smile before turning and leaving the room. "But you are moving," Tasha said firmly, "and people are watching. They see you, they believe because you refuse to stop." Marcus smiled faintly, gratitude softening the lines of exhaustion on his face. "Thank you, Tasha. You've been my rock through all of this." She nodded, blinking back the emotion pooling in her eyes. "Always, sir." With a final glance at the flowers and the note, Marcus grabbed his briefcase. "We've got work to do. The system doesn't fix itself." Later that morning, Marcus stood behind a polished podium in a packed press room. Rows of cameras and microphones pointed at him like a forest of glass eyes. Reporters filled every available seat, pens poised over notepads, and anticipation hung heavy in the air. Marcus adjusted the microphone, his deep voice filling the room. "Good morning. Today I stand here not just as the chief federal prosecutor for civil rights violations, but as a citizen, one who believes in the promise of justice, even when it seems out of reach." The crowd was silent, hanging on every word. Yesterday was not an anomaly. It was not a rare occurrence. What happened on those courthouse steps happens in cities and towns across this country every day. People are judged not by their character, but by assumptions, by prejudice, by fear. He paused, letting his words sink in. "But here's the thing about fear. It's loud, it's disruptive, but it's also fragile. Truth, on the other hand, truth is resilient. It endures. And every time someone chooses to stand for what's right, every time someone speaks up, that truth becomes harder to silence. The cameras clicked, capturing his earnest expression as he spoke. We cannot let moments like yesterday fade into headlines and hashtags. We must turn them into momentum, into change. And that change starts with accountability, transparency, and a shared commitment to fairness, not just in our institutions, but in our hearts. A ripple of emotion spread through the room. Some reporters lowered their pens, fully absorbed in his words. Marcus's voice softened, but it carried the same unwavering strength. This isn't just my fight, it's ours. Every citizen, every official, every parent teaching their child about right and wrong, we all carry this weight together. The room fell silent as Marcus stepped back from the podium. For a moment, no one moved. Then, a single pair of hands began to clap. Another joined, and then another. Soon, the room erupted into applause, not polite or obligatory, but raw, sincere, and deeply felt. That evening, Marcus walked home under a sky painted in lavender and gold. The city lights were beginning to flicker to life, one by one. He carried the small bouquet of flowers carefully in one hand, the note tucked safely in his pocket. When he reached his doorstep, he paused. The world felt quieter in this moment, but no less heavy. Justice was not a finish line he would ever cross. It was a road he would walk for the rest of his life. But in this stillness, Marcus felt something else. Hope. Not the fleeting kind, not the fragile type that shatters under pressure, but something deeper, something steady. Inside his home, Marcus placed the bouquet in a glass jar filled with water and set it on the windowsill. The flowers, though slightly wilted, caught the light of the street lamp outside, casting soft shadows on the wall. He sat down, his shoulders relaxing for the first time in what felt like days. The weight was still there, but now it felt shared, carried by every person who believed in him, who believed in justice, who believed that the fight was worth it. Marcus Hayes closed his eyes and let out a long, steady breath. Tomorrow, the fight would continue. But tonight, he allowed himself a moment of peace. The story concludes with a powerful reminder. True change isn't instantaneous, nor is it easy. But it's built on moments of courage, integrity, and the refusal to back down in the face of adversity. Marcus Hayes embodies that spirit. Not as a hero, but as a man who simply refuses to stop fighting for what's right.